The Atlantic wind moves through the dune grass in long, silent waves. It is late September 1988. The hour approaches 3 in the morning, and the beaches of East Hampton lie empty beneath a sky without moon. Along this stretch of coastline, where the wealthiest families of New York have built their monuments to privacy, most homes stand dark. But in one residence, a single light remains. The house itself is an exercise in disappearance. Low to the ground, horizontal in its geometry, it seems less built than carved from absence. Glass walls face the ocean, reflecting nothing. Inside, the rooms are white. The floors are white. The furniture, what little exists, follows the same discipline. There are no paintings on the walls, no photographs, no accumulation of objects that might reveal the passage of time or the presence of a life lived in full. This is the home of Calvin Klein, and tonight he sits alone. The official record of this period describes a man at the height of American fashion. His name appears on jeans worn by millions. His advertisements have redefined the visual language of desire. His fragrance, Obsession, launched just 3 years prior, has become one of the most successful perfumes in history. The business he built from a single coat in 1968 now generates revenues approaching $700 million annually. By every external measure, he has achieved what the industry calls total brand dominance. But the man sitting in this white room at 3 in the morning is not the figure who appears in business profiles. He is 45 years old. He has not slept properly in weeks. The minimalism that surrounds him, once a statement of aesthetic conviction, has taken on a different character. The emptiness is no longer a choice. It has become a condition. What happens in the hours that follow will not appear in any contemporary newspaper account. The events of this autumn will be managed, contained, and eventually reframed as a story of corporate triumph rather than personal crisis. But within the closed circle of those who knew him, a different understanding takes shape. The house in East Hampton, with its perfect white rooms and its views of an indifferent ocean, becomes something more than a weekend retreat. It becomes a place of withdrawal, a refuge from a public life that has grown unbearable, and eventually a kind of exile. The fashion industry of the late 1980s operates according to specific rules of discretion. Certain struggles are understood but never named. Certain absences from public events are explained with references to exhaustion or overseas travel. The machinery of image management, already sophisticated, works to ensure that the distance between the public figure and the private man remains absolute. Calvin Klein has mastered this separation more completely than perhaps any designer of his generation. The minimalism is not merely aesthetic, it is strategic. Yet within this strategy lies a contradiction that will define the years to come. The same man who has built an empire on the projection of control finds himself in these small hours, confronting its opposite. The white rooms offer no hiding place. The glass walls, designed to frame the beauty of the landscape, also eliminate every shadow. In a space without clutter, without distraction, without the accumulated evidence of ordinary living, there is only the self exposed. The house was completed in 1985, designed to Klein's exacting specifications. Every material was selected for its capacity to recede. The goal, as he explained to architectural journalists, was the elimination of visual noise. What he did not explain, what perhaps he did not fully understand himself, was that such elimination carries its own weight. A room stripped of everything non-essential eventually reveals what cannot be removed. Outside, the Atlantic continues its rhythm against the shore. The dune grass bends and recovers. Somewhere to the west, the accumulated lights of New York City cast a faint glow against the clouds. But here, at the eastern edge of Long Island, that world seems impossibly distant. The parties, the studio sessions, the negotiations and launches and campaigns that constitute the daily reality of a fashion empire, all of it exists in a separate dimension. The beach house was built precisely to create this separation. Tonight, that separation feels complete. In the weeks ahead, Calvin Klein will enter the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota. The announcement, when it comes, will be carefully worded. The rehabilitation will be described as treatment for addiction to alcohol and Valium. What remains unspoken is the longer trajectory that led to this moment, the pressures and compromises and private reckonings that accumulated over 2 decades of building one of America's most recognized brands. The White House in East Hampton will wait, empty through the autumn months. The ocean will continue its indifferent approach and retreat. The Bronx of the early 1940s offered few obvious pathways to the world Calvin Klein would eventually inhabit. He was born in November 1942, the son of Leo Klein, a Hungarian immigrant who ran a grocery store on Harlem River Drive. The family lived in a modest apartment in the Mosholu Parkway section, a neighborhood of striving Jewish families who measured success in the education of their children and the slow accumulation of small securities. There was nothing in this environment to suggest fashion. There was nothing to suggest the particular obsession with refinement that would later define both the man and his work. Yet even in childhood, according to those who knew the family, certain tendencies were visible. His mother, Flore, dressed with care that exceeded the family's modest circumstances. She took the young Calvin to Lohman's, the discount designer store in the Bronx, and taught him to recognize quality fabric by touch. She enrolled him in art classes. She encouraged a sensitivity to visual detail that set him apart from the other boys in the neighborhood. Whether this cultivation was intuitive or deliberate, whether Flora Klein understood what she was nurturing, remains unclear. What is certain is that by adolescence, Calvin Klein had developed an eye that saw differently. He attended the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, commuting from the Bronx each day into a world that must have seemed both foreign and necessary. The school trained students in commercial art, in the practical applications of aesthetic judgment. Klein excelled, but his ambitions were already specific. He wanted to design clothing. He wanted, though he could not yet articulate it in these terms, to create a visual language that would translate elegance into democratic form. The tension between aspiration and origin, between the Bronx apartment and the Manhattan showroom, would power everything that followed. After graduation, he enrolled at the Fashion Institute of Technology, then apprenticed at a series of 7th Avenue coat and suit houses. The work was unglamorous. He spent years learning the mechanics of garment construction, the economics of manufacturing, the brutal realities of an industry built on seasonal reinvention and narrow margins. He married his high school sweetheart, Jane Center, in 1964. Their daughter Marcy was born the following year. The young family lived in Queens, and Klein took the subway each day to jobs that paid modestly and demanded everything. The origin story of the Calvin Klein brand has been told many times, refined into a parable of American enterprise. In 1968, with a childhood friend named Barry Schwartz providing $40,000 in capital, Klein opened a small coat shop in the York Hotel on 7th Avenue. The space was barely functional. The inventory was limited. But within weeks, a buyer from Bonwit Teller wandered in, reportedly by accident, having pushed the wrong elevator button. She saw the coats, recognized their quality, and placed an order worth $50,000. The story is almost certainly true in its essential details, though the decades have polished it into something resembling myth. What matters more than its accuracy is what it reveals about Klein's understanding of his own trajectory. He was not merely lucky, he was prepared. The coats that caught the buyer's attention represented years of accumulated knowledge, thousands of hours spent learning what distinguished exceptional garments from merely competent ones. The elevator accident created an opportunity. The work that preceded it made the opportunity meaningful. Throughout the 1970s, the Calvin Klein brand expanded with disciplined velocity. Sportswear followed coats. The aesthetic remained consistent: clean lines, muted colors, an emphasis on cut-over ornamentation. While other designers embraced the excesses of the decade, Klein pursued a different vision. His clothes suggested restraint. They implied that the true sophistication required the elimination of the unnecessary. In an era of maximalism, this positioning proved remarkably effective. The business partnership with Barry Schwartz provided crucial stability. Schwartz handled operations, manufacturing, licensing, and the complex negotiations that transformed a design sensibility into a commercial enterprise. Klein focused on the creative work and, increasingly, on the cultivation of public image. The division was clean and, by most accounts, genuinely collaborative. Schwartz understood that the brand's value resided in Klein's vision. Klein understood that vision without execution was worthless. Together, they built something neither could have achieved alone. By the middle of the decade, the company had established itself as a significant force in American fashion. But it was the jeans that changed everything. In 1978, Calvin Klein introduced designer denim at a price point that seemed audacious. The strategy depended on advertising that matched the audacity. The campaign that followed, featuring a 15-year-old Brooke Shields, declaring that nothing came between her and her Calvins, generated outrage, attention, and sales that exceeded all projections. The controversy was not incidental. It was integral to the brand's emerging identity. What the public saw was provocation. What Klein understood was something more precise. The advertisements worked because they created discomfort, and discomfort created memorability. The minimalism of his designs found its complement in the minimalism of the imagery. Young bodies, simple settings, direct address to the camera. Everything non-essential was stripped away, leaving only desire and the product that promised to fulfill it. The method was clinical beneath its sensuality. The results were transformative. The 1980s arrived like a vindication. Everything Calvin Klein had built in the previous decade now accelerated into cultural dominance. The company expanded into underwear, fragrances, accessories, and home goods. Each extension followed the same logic. Take a category considered utilitarian and elevate it through design discipline and provocative marketing. The method was repeatable. The results compounded. By 1983, Calvin Klein Industries had become one of the most valuable fashion brands in America. The underwear business proved particularly transformative. Before Klein, men's undergarments occupied a purely functional category, sold in plastic packaging, and rarely considered as objects of aesthetic value. The decision to photograph the Olympic pole vaulter Tom Hintenhaus in white briefs, his body displayed against a stark background, redefined the category entirely. The billboard that appeared in Times Square in 1983 stopped traffic. It generated complaints, parodies, and imitations that continued for years. More importantly, it sold millions of units at premium prices. What distinguished Klein's approach was not merely the use of sexuality, but its specific calibration. The images were explicit enough to provoke, but restrained enough to appear in mainstream publications. The bodies were idealized, but not impossible. The settings were minimal, almost clinical, directing attention to the product and the flesh that wore it. This precision was not accidental. Klein reviewed every photograph, every layout, every word of copy. The control was absolute. His personal life during this period operated according to different principles. The marriage to Jane Center had ended in 1974, and in the years that followed, Klein moved through New York's social landscape with increasing visibility. Studio 54 was at its height, and Klein became one of its most recognizable regulars. The club offered a darkness that complemented his daylight discipline. Within its walls, the boundaries he maintained so carefully in his professional life dissolved. The minimalist who spent his days eliminating excess spent his nights in environments defined by it. The relationships that emerged from this world varied in duration and character. Klein was involved with women and men, though the precise nature of these connections remained, by design, ambiguous. The fashion industry of the era maintained certain silences. Sexuality was understood to exist along a spectrum, and discretion was valued above confession. Klein neither confirmed nor denied. He simply continued, allowing the ambiguity to become another form of control. In 1986, he married Kelly Rector, a design assistant 10 years his junior. The wedding took place in Rome, and the photographs that circulated showed a couple of apparent contentment. Rector brought stability, a domesticity that Klein had not experienced since his first marriage. Together, they would shape the East Hampton residence into something resembling a shared home. Whether this stability addressed the underlying turbulence or merely contained it remained, for a time, unclear. The fragrance obsession launched in 1985 and became the defining product of the decade. The name itself was a statement of intent. The advertising, featuring intertwined bodies in configurations that suggested passion beyond the merely romantic, pushed boundaries that Klein had only approached previously. The campaign generated protests, calls for boycotts, and sales that exceeded $100 million in the first year alone. The pattern was by now familiar. Controversy converted into commercial success through the alchemy of cultural attention. Yet within this success, certain fractures were becoming visible to those who looked closely. The pace of work had grown relentless. The company now operated across multiple categories, each demanding creative oversight that Klein refused to delegate. The advertising campaigns, which had once been seasonal events, now arrived in continuous sequence. The pressure to maintain provocation while avoiding genuine offense required constant calibration. Klein worked longer hours. He slept less. The discipline that had built the empire was beginning to consume its creator. The drugs entered gradually, then decisively. Cocaine was ubiquitous in the fashion and entertainment worlds of the 1980s, treated less as a vice than as a professional tool. It allowed longer hours, greater focus, the temporary suspension of exhaustion. Klein was not exceptional in his use. He was exceptional only in the degree to which his public image depended on control, while his private reality moved toward its opposite. The minimalist aesthetic that defined his brand, the white rooms, the empty spaces, the elimination of everything unnecessary, became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the chemical chaos of his actual experience. The Hamptons house served as a tempted refuge. Weekends away from the city were meant to provide recovery, perspective, the restoration of equilibrium. But the same qualities that made the residence a masterpiece of architectural restraint also made it a peculiar setting for a man in crisis. The white walls offered no distraction. The ocean views, however beautiful, provided no escape from interior weather. Klein would sit in these rooms, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his aesthetic philosophy, and confront the distance between what he had built and what he had become. By 1988, the distance had grown unbearable. The company continued its expansion. The advertisements continued their provocations. The public Calvin Klein remained a figure of almost intimidating success. But the private man had reached a threshold that no amount of professional achievement could address. The decision to enter rehabilitation was not a choice made from strength. It was an acknowledgement that the mechanisms of control had failed. Hazelden sits among the lakes and pine forests of Minnesota, far removed from the pressures of 7th Avenue. The facility had treated prominent figures before, though the protocols of anonymity prevented public acknowledgement. Calvin Klein arrived in the autumn of 1988, accompanied by the understanding that his stay would remain confidential. The fashion industry was informed only that he was taking time away. The specific nature of this absence was managed with the same precision that governed every other aspect of brand communication. The treatment at Hazelden followed established protocols: 30 days of structured rehabilitation, group therapy sessions, the systematic confrontation with patterns of dependency that had accumulated over years. For a man accustomed to absolute control over his environment, the experience required a different kind of discipline. The rooms were not white, the furnishings were not minimal. The days were organized according to someone else's schedule. Everything that had defined Klein's approach to living, the careful curation, The elimination of disorder, the sovereignty over aesthetic detail, was temporarily suspended. What emerged from those 30 days remained largely private. Klein did not speak publicly about the experience for years, and when he eventually addressed it, his comments were measured. He acknowledged the addiction to Valium and alcohol. He expressed gratitude for the intervention of friends who had recognized what he could not. He described the recovery as ongoing rather than complete. The minimalism of these statements matched the minimalism of his designs. Nothing excessive, nothing that revealed more than necessary. His return to New York in late 1988 was handled with characteristic discretion. There were no press conferences, no public acknowledgements of where he had been or what had occurred. The company continued its operations without visible interruption. The spring collections proceeded on schedule. The advertising campaigns maintained their provocative edge. From the outside, nothing had changed. The machinery of the Calvin Klein brand was sufficiently robust to absorb the temporary absence of its creator without losing momentum. But those who worked closely with him noticed differences. The hours were less punishing. The social calendar contracted. The nights at clubs and restaurants, which had once been a regular feature of his existence, became rare. Kelly Rector's influence was evident in this recalibration. The marriage provided structure, a domestic rhythm that offered alternatives to the relentless pace that had characterized the previous decade. The East Hampton house became more than a weekend retreat. It became a genuine residence, occupied with increasing frequency as Klein sought distance from the environments that had enabled his earlier patterns. The architecture of that house took on new significance in this period. The minimalism that had once seemed purely aesthetic now served a therapeutic function. The white rooms eliminated visual triggers. The empty spaces reduced the chaos that cluttered ordinary environments. The discipline required to maintain such a residence, nothing out of place, nothing accumulated, nothing allowed to disrupt the careful composition, provided a framework for the discipline required to maintain sobriety. The house became a practice as much as a place. The early 1990s brought both consolidation and new challenges. The fashion industry was shifting, moving away from the excesses of the previous decade toward something more restrained. Klein's aesthetic, which had always emphasized simplicity, was suddenly aligned with broader cultural currents. The timing appeared fortunate, though fortune had little to do with it. The consistency of his vision meant that when the culture moved in his direction, the brand was positioned to benefit without any visible adjustment. The fragrance CK1, launched in 1994, captured this moment precisely. Marketed as a unisex scent, packaged in a simple bottle that rejected the ornate conventions of the industry, it became one of the most successful fragrance launches in history. The advertising featured groups of young people, diverse in appearance, but unified in their studied casualness. The imagery suggested a new generation, unburdened by the rigid categories of gender and sexuality that had defined previous eras. The product was minimal. The message was minimal. The sales exceeded $200 million in the first year. Yet the same year brought a different kind of attention. The advertising campaign for CK Jeans, featuring very young models in settings that suggested basement photography studios, generated a controversy unlike any Klein had faced before. The images were accused of evoking child exploitation, of pushing provocation past acceptable boundaries into something darker. The American Family Association demanded action. News programs featured the advertisements in segments about the decline of public morality. For the first time, the Klein formula, controversy as marketing, encountered resistance that could not be converted into commercial advantage. The company withdrew the campaign within weeks, issuing statements that expressed regret while stopping short of apology. Klein himself remained largely silent during the public debate. The internal discussions, whatever they contained, did not become part of the public record. What was clear, however, was that a limit had been reached. The strategy that had built the brand through calculated transgression had finally transgressed beyond what the culture would absorb. The minimalist who had made his fortune by eliminating everything unnecessary had finally eliminated too much, including, some argued, the basic protections afforded to childhood. The East Hampton house received him during this period as it had received him before. The white rooms offered their familiar blankness. The ocean continued its rhythms without commentary on the events transpiring in Manhattan. Whatever Klein thought or felt about the controversy, whatever private reckonings occurred in those minimal spaces, remained contained within their walls. The public figure survived the crisis. The brand continued. But something had shifted in the relationship between the man and the machinery he had created. The late 1990s brought a quieter form of reckoning. The controversy over the jeans campaign had passed from headlines into industry memory, but its residue lingered in ways that were difficult to measure. Advertisers and retailers who had once celebrated Klein's provocations now approached new campaigns with heightened scrutiny. The formula remained effective, but its execution required greater care. The margin between transgression and backlash had narrowed, and Klein understood that the territory he had once navigated with confidence had become treacherous. The business itself continued to generate substantial revenue. The licensing agreements that Barry Schwartz had negotiated over the decades now produced income streams that operated almost independently of current creative work. The Calvin Klein name appeared on products ranging from eyewear to bedding, each category contributing royalties that accumulated into figures approaching the billion-dollar threshold. The brand had achieved a kind of self-perpetuating momentum. Whether this momentum required Klein's continued involvement was a question that began to surface in boardroom discussions. His marriage to Kelly Rector had stabilized his personal life for nearly a decade, but by the mid-1990s, strains were becoming evident. The couple maintained residences in Manhattan and East Hampton, moving between them according to schedules that increasingly diverged. Kelly had her own career interests, her own social circles, her own trajectory that did not always align with the demands of serving as the spouse of a fashion icon. The public appearances continued, the photographs at charity events and industry functions, but those who knew them well perceived a growing distance. The East Hampton property underwent expansions during this period. Klein acquired adjacent parcels, extending his control over the landscape surrounding the original residence. The architectural vision remained consistent: low structures, white interiors, the subordination of building to horizon, but the scale had grown. What had begun as a beach house had become a compound, multiple structures arranged across the dunes with the precision of a master plan. The minimalism, rather than limiting expansion, had become a framework for it. Each new building followed the same discipline, creating a cumulative effect of almost monastic severity. Within these spaces, Klein pursued a life increasingly removed from the daily operations of his company. The design work continued, but his involvement had become more editorial than generative. Younger designers produced collections that he reviewed and refined. The advertising campaigns, once his personal obsession, now moved through approval processes that required less of his direct attention. The machinery had matured to the point where it could function with reduced input from its creator. This efficiency, which might have been experienced as freedom, seemed instead to produce a kind of purposelessness. The fashion industry was changing around him in ways that the minimalist aesthetic could not fully address. New designers emerged with approaches that rejected the clean lines and neutral palettes that Klein had championed. Street influences, irony, deliberate ugliness. These currents moved through the culture with an energy that made the Calvin Klein brand seem, to some observers, like a relic of an earlier era. The company responded with adjustments, introducing new lines aimed at younger consumers, but the core identity remained rooted in principles established decades before. Barry Schwartz, who had managed the business side of the partnership since its founding, began to discuss exit strategies. The men were now in their late 50s, wealthy beyond any reasonable measure, and facing questions about succession that had no obvious answers. The company bore Calvin Klein's name, but what would that name mean without Calvin Klein's involvement? The licensing agreements had diluted the brand's exclusivity. The controversies had complicated its image. The question of whether to sell and to whom moved from theoretical discussion to active negotiation. The conversations with potential acquirers proceeded quietly through the early 2000s. Philips Van Huysen, a company with expertise in managing acquired brands, emerged as the leading candidate. The negotiations involved valuations, transition arrangements, and agreements about Klein's continued role that would occupy lawyers and investment bankers for months. The figure eventually agreed upon was approximately $700 million, a sum that reflected both the brand's historic value and the uncertainties surrounding its future. The sale closed in early 2003. Calvin Klein, at 60 years old, was no longer the owner of the company that bore his name. He retained a consulting role, an arrangement that provided continued income while limiting his operational responsibilities. The minimalist who had built an empire through the elimination of the unnecessary had now eliminated his own necessity. The brand would continue without him, managed by executives who understood its commercial value but had not participated in its creation. The East Hampton compound received him with its familiar silence. The white rooms remained as he had designed them, unchanged by the transactions occurring in Manhattan boardrooms. The ocean continued its approaches and retreats. But the relationship between the man and this landscape had shifted. He was no longer retreating from the pressures of a business he controlled. He was inhabiting a retirement he had not entirely chosen, surrounded by the physical manifestations of an aesthetic philosophy that had once been inseparable from productive work. Kelly Rector filed for divorce in 2006. The marriage had lasted 20 years, longer than many in the fashion industry, but its end was not unexpected by those who had observed its gradual erosion. The settlement details remained private, as such matters typically do among the wealthy. What became public was simply the fact of separation, another transition in a life that had been defined by transitions. Klein was now 63, unmarried, no longer operationally involved in the company he had founded, living between properties that embodied a vision of perfection he had spent decades pursuing. The years following the divorce brought a peculiar kind of liberty. Calvin Klein was no longer bound by the obligations of marriage or the demands of corporate leadership. The wealth accumulated over 4 decades provided resources sufficient to sustain any lifestyle he might choose. The properties in Manhattan and East Hampton offered settings calibrated to his exact preferences. Yet freedom, in the absence of structure, can become its own form of confinement. The minimalist spaces that had once provided refuge from chaos now enclosed a life searching for new purpose. He remained a presence in the fashion world, though the nature of that presence had changed. Industry events still sought his attendance. Younger designers still cited his influence. The fashion press still requested interviews on significant anniversaries, but the relationship had shifted from participant to monument. He was celebrated for what he had accomplished, rather than consulted about what might come next. The present tense had given way to the past, even as he continued to occupy physical space in the rooms where decisions were being made. The Manhattan real estate reflected this transitional status. Klein had maintained apartments in various buildings over the decades, each reflecting his evolving circumstances and aesthetic refinements. The spaces grew larger and more expensive as his wealth increased, but the interior logic remained constant. White walls, minimal furniture, art selected for its capacity to complement rather than compete with the architecture. Visitors described environments that felt less like homes than like galleries prepared for exhibition. The personal had been so thoroughly edited that what remained was almost purely formal. His romantic life during this period became subject to tabloid attention in ways it had largely avoided during his married years. Klein was photographed with younger companions, men whose presence at restaurants and events generated speculation about the nature of these relationships. He offered no clarifications. The same discretion that had characterized his approach to sexuality throughout his career continued to govern his public presentation. What occurred in private remained private, protected by wealth and the habits of a lifetime spent managing image. The East Hampton compound continued its expansion. Klein acquired additional properties along the oceanfront, assembling a collection of parcels that provided both privacy and control over the surrounding viewscape. The architecture maintained its discipline, each structure adhering to the principles established in the original residence, but the accumulation itself suggested something beyond aesthetic commitment. The multiplication of minimal spaces created an environment of almost excessive emptiness, a void that expanded to fill whatever acreage became available. The fashion industry he had helped define was undergoing transformations that made his legacy both more secure and more distant. Fast fashion had democratized access to design in ways that his own work had anticipated but never fully embraced. The minimalism he championed had become so thoroughly absorbed into mainstream retail that its origins were no longer visible. Young consumers purchased clean-lined garments without any awareness of the battles fought to establish such simplicity as desirable. The revolution had succeeded so completely that it had erased the memory of what it had replaced. Philips Van Heusen, which had acquired the Calvin Klein brand, continued to extend its reach into new categories and markets. The name appeared on products Klein had never designed, in countries he had never visited, worn by consumers who knew nothing of the Bronx grocery store or the York hotel elevator. The brand had achieved complete independence from its creator. This was, in commercial terms, the ultimate success, a name so powerful that it transcended the individual who had given it meaning. Whether Klein experienced this transcendence as triumph or dispossession remained unclear from his public statements. His health became a subject of concern in the early 2010s. Klein appeared at events looking thinner than in previous years. His features sharpened in ways that prompted quiet speculation. The fashion industry, accustomed to bodies maintained through discipline and intervention, nonetheless noticed changes that suggested something beyond ordinary aging. No public statements addressed these observations. The privacy that had always surrounded his personal life extended to matters of physical condition. Whatever was occurring, whatever treatments or struggles might be involved, remained within the walls of his minimal residences. The relationship with his daughter Marcy had evolved over the decades into something stable, if not entirely intimate. She had survived her own difficulties, a kidnapping in 1978 that had traumatized the family, subsequent struggles that played out largely away from public attention. As adults, father and daughter maintained connection without the performative closeness that some families display. They appeared together occasionally, photographed at events where family presence was expected. The images suggested civility rather than warmth, the careful maintenance of bonds that had weathered considerable strain. The Hampton social scene continued to orbit around him, even as his participation diminished. His property remained among the most significant on that stretch of coastline, its value measured not merely in acreage, but in the cultural weight attached to its owner. Neighbors included figures from finance, entertainment, and media whose own achievements paled beside the sustained visibility of the Klein name. To own property near Calvin Klein was to participate, however distantly, in a narrative of American success that had been unfolding for half a century. Yet the man himself appeared increasingly detached from this narrative. Sightings became less frequent. Public appearances grew rarer. The restaurants and events that had once relied on his presence learned to proceed without him. The minimalist had applied his philosophy to social obligation, eliminating engagements that no longer served clear purpose. What remained was the compound, the white rooms, the ocean view that had witnessed decades of triumph and crisis without offering commentary on either. The compound stands today much as it has stood for decades. The white structures hold their horizontal lines against the sky. The dune grass continues its slow negotiation with the Atlantic wind. From the beach, if one walks far enough east along the waterline, The buildings become visible as interruptions in the natural landscape, deliberate, precise, unyielding in their commitment to an aesthetic vision that has outlasted marriages, scandals, and the shifting fortunes of the industry that made them possible. Calvin Klein turned 80 in November 2022. The occasion passed without significant public ceremony. The fashion press noted the anniversary with retrospective articles that traced the familiar arc from Bronx childhood to 7th Avenue dominance. The photographs accompanying these pieces showed the progression of a face over 6 decades, young and hungry in the early portraits, confident and controlled through the years of empire building, finally settling into an expression that resisted easy interpretation. The minimalism extended even to facial affect. Nothing excessive, nothing revealed. The brand that bears his name continues its global operations under corporate ownership, now several transactions removed from the original sale. The advertising still courts controversy, though the controversies themselves have changed character in an era of different sensitivities. The clean lines and neutral palettes remain recognizable elements of the visual identity, maintained by designers who learned their craft from precedents Klein established before they were born. The name appears on storefronts in cities he will never visit, worn by bodies he will never see. The Manhattan properties have been consolidated. The East Hampton compound remains. Between these coordinates, a life continues in forms that rarely intersect with public documentation. The photographs that occasionally surface show a man dressed in the uniform he established decades ago. Simple garments, precise fit, colors that refuse to announce themselves. The body within these clothes has weathered 8 decades, with the evidence such weathering produces. The eyes still convey the attention to detail that built everything that followed. What the white rooms contain now, what thoughts occupy the mind that conceived them, belongs to a privacy that has been earned through its consistent protection. The windows still frame the ocean. The light still moves across surfaces designed to receive it without distortion. The emptiness that once signified ambition, then refuge, then perhaps something closer to resignation, maintains its refusal to specify meaning. The architecture keeps its secrets as architecture does, offering form without interpretation. The Atlantic approaches the shore in its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the structures that observe it. The dune grass bends and recovers. Somewhere within those white walls, in rooms stripped of everything that might distract from the essential, the man who built an empire on the principle of elimination continues his residence. The story does not conclude. It simply reaches the point where observation ends and speculation becomes inappropriate. The minimal life, pursued to its logical extension, finally achieves the privacy it was always designed to protect. The wind moves through the grass. The waves maintain their schedule. The house holds its silence.